Hello and welcome, everyone. I had a question by a viewer about tactics versus strategy. And so I'm going to go over two random games by Capablanca here, and we'll try and decide, do tactics really decide most chess games? How much strategy is involved in endgame maneuvering? So we'll see in the game, how much tactics actually plays a role. So this first game, it is, let's see here. Capablanca, the third world chess champion, had the white pieces, and he plays against Vera Menchik, who was a top female player back then. I believe she was even the female world champion at some point, and this should be an interesting game. Now, Capablanca is higher rated than her in this, so in the second game after this one, I'll do a more even game between the second world chess champion, Emmanuel Lasker, and Capablanca, who was the third world chess champion. All right, so let's take a look at this game. It looks like Capablanca played with 96.2% accuracy versus 88.1%. And he even had a brilliant and four great moves. Only one inaccuracy and one mistake versus his opponent, who had five inaccuracies and three mistakes. All right, so I'll look at the analysis here. Capablanca begins with d4, and then we have d5 with the response. And so already this will be more of a strategic game, maybe less tactics. So c4 is played, the Queen's Gambit. So here your options are, to either accept the gambit and capture this pawn, which could allow white to push his e-pawn and take control of the center, or you can decline the gambit, which is what his opponent did. So e6 just backs up that pawn. Now knight to c3 puts more pressure on the pawn. And this move here, c5, the Terrace defense. So black immediately tries to counterattack in the center and keep things kind of even. We'll see what happens here. So Capablanca captures, a recapture, and then the knight is developed here. So already Capablanca has two knights developed and one center pawn. So the opponent responds with developing their knight as well. And now we have g3 being played here. So the game is pretty interesting here. A lot of tension in the center. Black is avoiding capturing here. Black could be left with an isolated queen pawn. So now both sides are just developing pieces and getting ready to castle. So now that they've castled, Capablanca does exchange off here in the center. And so now this bishop, which already developed, must recapture, move again and recapture that pawn. And now this gives Capablanca time to either develop, but instead he decides to attack here. And Capablanca's opponent, wishing to avoid losing the bishop pair, retreats here, but Capablanca is left with this knight on the rim here, which it can be a problem as it has less influence on the side of the board there. All right, so continuing on, we have this knight jumping up here, exerting pressure on white's side of the board. And now rook to c1 takes control, or tries to exert more control on this open c file here. So the final pieces are being developed here by both sides. And black has their rooks connected, and White decides to do something about this awful knight that was on the side of the board and jumps up here attacking the queen and the bishop. So recapture here. So black wished to avoid losing the bishop pair and must exchange off that great knight that they had here on e4. So capture, and now black places a rook here on the c file to fight for control of the c file, and now also this bishop is under pressure. So that is ignored, and the queen move is made here by Capablanca, which is an inaccuracy. So far, as far as tactics, we haven't had anything too crazy, just normal attacking. And now, when I talk about tactics, I just mean, that can be anything from attacking a piece and forcing your opponent to respond to that immediate threat. It could be a double attack, a fork, discovered attacks, checkmate threats. That's what I'm talking about when I say tactics, where strategy is long-term thinking and maneuvering. That could be trying to get a pawn majority on one side, trying to break apart your opponent's pawns. So here we see black has 3 pawn islands, one here on the king side, this isolated pawn, and one over here, where white just has 2 pawn islands, these 2 here, and then all these pawns over here. So this could be a weakness here. So a lot of strategy going on in this game. So now bishop to c5, capturing on c5, and the computer says that is an inaccuracy, that it would have been better just to develop the bishop over here and line up on this pawn, take that long diagonal. All right, so we have a trade, and now black retreats, offering to trade off a pair of rooks here. So capture, capture, and now instead of bringing the other rook over to fight for that open file and possibly trade off more material, the knight is jumped up here to d4, and it does a fine job of blockading this isolated pawn. So when you have an isolated pawn, there's a lot of strategy involved. You want to try and block the pawn. The knight is one of the best blockaders. So once you stop that pawn from moving forward, it's an easier target when it's not moving. And at the same time, you want to try and trade off material if you can. So as more and more pieces are traded off, it becomes harder to defend that pawn. Now, the bonus of having an isolated pawn is that it can give you some counterplay, some attacking chances, like this rook, able to shoot down this open c file here, and if you had your other rook, you could have it here attacking down the e file. So it does give you some openings that you could possibly use to attack with. So now we have this attack on the bishop, getting ready to trade off there and give white some weaknesses. Once these bishops are exchanged, these light squares could be weaker here around the king. So that's ignored, and now we have a battery created here on this half open file, lining up here and targeting this isolated pawn. So exchanging off here, and now h6 is played, which I guess that keeps the queen from maneuvering up here towards the king side. It also gives some room for the king to escape and get off the back rank if that is needed. All right, so now queen to f4. So far, a lot of strategy, but as far as tactics, there were a lot of tactical threats as far as just attacking pieces and trading off. So tactics and strategy go hand in hand. You can use the short-term tactics of attacking pieces and pawns, or the king even, to kind of steer your strategy in the direction that you want it to go in. So here, white should be trying to trade off as many pieces as they can, and then it'll be easier to go in after this pawn here. So the strategy would be to blockade the pawn and then target it at the same time trying to trade off pieces. So then your tactics would involve attacking your enemy's pieces and trying to trade them off. All right, so we have a6 here, just keeping the knight out of here in the future, getting ready to push this pawn, maybe try and trade off some pawns. So the rook is moved up here, where now it'll have the option to maybe go over here at some point. Just a little bit more maneuverability. Maybe even go here and threaten this pawn with a battery of rook and queen. So the game continues with rook to c4. And now we have a tactic here, a pin of this knight to the queen. So let's see how Capablanca responds there. It says, the computer says the best move would have been to get out of that pin and just move here back to d2. But instead we have an attack on the bishop here. And that could also be it's a tactic, attacking the piece immediately, but it's also a good strategy of lining your pawn up here with your rook where it can be protected. And now we have a retreat by the rook, and now white maneuvers his rook over here to target this knight. So we'll see what happens next here. And the computer says that white should have just pushed this pawn, which would prevent the black pawns from pushing forward, because then you could just capture, it would at least slow them down from moving forward. All right, so the king moves over here to help protect the knight, but now the king is lined up, the queen is lined up on the king there. And h4. So the strategy here, other than gaining a little space here on the king side, it can help slow down the pawns. So now g5 is not possible to attack the queen, because then you would just capture, and then after a recapture, the queen could capture. So now king to g8 is best, getting off of that line of the queen here, and maybe waiting to see what Capablanca will do. And now h5, just gaining more space. So a lot of strategy here. And now the threat here, so we have a tactical threat of capturing with a check here. So rook move to protect that pawn, but computer says that's an inaccuracy, which was probably hard to see. Instead, it recommends knight to c6 here, attacking the knight, and then the queen would also be protecting here. So I don't know, this is what the computer wants. So now you're targeting the knight, the pawn is protected, and you keep your rook here guarding your pawn instead of putting it in a more passive defensive position behind this f pawn. Here at least you're doing something more active, an immediate threat of capturing this knight here. So let's move on. So in the game, after we have the rook and queen lining up here, the opponent played defense, and Capablanca just pushes on the queen side now. And we have this mistake. King to h7. So the computer does not like that, but it prefers king to h8. So let's see here. Capablanca moves his rook over. Now that there's not much he can do here, he tries to take control of this open file. And now we have the knight blocking the file but attacking this knight here. And now Capablanca makes a mistake. So knight to f5. It looks like it would have been better to just go ahead and capture the knight, because then the queen couldn't capture, of course, because of this rook, and black would have had to capture with a pawn and then be left with a backwards pawn here. So, tactics and strategy. The tactic would be, just to capture a piece, and then that would steer the game into a more favorable strategic position. So after capture, you would have to capture with this pawn because the queen can't capture because of the rook. But now you have this backwards pawn here, which can become a target. We've gotten rid, I guess black has gotten rid of his isolated pawn here, but now he's left with another weakness, this backwards pawn. And it looks like now queen to e3 or d4 would be the best moves to try and take control of this square here, prevent the pawns from moving. And let's see, queen to e3, is that what it said? All right, yeah, queen to e3. So here's something interesting. Queen to e3, it says, is the best move. And you may think, well, what about the tactical possibility of a fork here? Well, that wouldn't work, which I can show you real quick here. Because of this, this would be a mistake, because now you can just play queen to d3, and if the rook is captured, well, then you just pick off the queen, because we have the tactical maneuver here of pinning this pawn to the queen. And then now this pawn would be easier to pick off. So that's another example of how the tactics come into play to, even if you're playing positionally, the tactics that are threatened, they don't even have to be played. Sometimes you just threaten tactics, and that'll steer the game or maneuver the game in a certain direction, even if it's a strategic game and there's not a lot of actual tactics happening. The underlying tactics can steer the game and determine how the strategic position changes and evolves. All right, so if we go back here, after rook to c3, the knight moves. We have, instead of the capture, we had this move by Capablanca, knight to f5. It looks like he just wants to maneuver up here closer to the king and start threatening, with maybe the queen lining up here and attacking this g7 pawn, a tactical threat of a mate in one, and stuff like that. The threats that you have building will determine what strategy you may need to play. So the opponent responds, and the computer says this is a mistake, but here's the response. The best move is played, rook to e8, attacking this pawn here. And so now we have the queen moving and protecting, but also the tactical threat of mate in one here. So now the pawn is pushed forward, and this allows a capture. So now Capablanca has used the tactics to slightly improve his strategical position. He's able to get rid of this weak pawn on the side of the board and capture towards the center. And now he has a open or half open rank here that lines up on the king. So we have a recapture. The knight is under attack now. So Capablanca plays a brilliant move, giving up his knight here. So, well, at least capturing the pawn, and black has the opportunity to capture this knight. But in the game, the queen is captured, and then a recapture. So Capablanca's opponent decided to trade down material even though they're behind. So we have 4 pawns versus 5. And normally when you're behind in material, you don't want to trade off pieces, you want to trade off pawns. So if we go back and look at this, after this move, queen captures is an inaccuracy. Queen to g7 is what the computer wants. So let's take a closer look at this. So queen to g7, attacking the knight. And then that knight would be trapped there. So we'll take a look at that. Just seeing what else. Queen takes g4 was the second best move, but let's see what happens here. So now the tactic that's at play here is the knight is under attack, and where can the knight go? If the knight goes here, it'll just be captured by this pawn. It's pretty much trapped. So it looks like in this position there is another tactic, and the only move that works here is rook to c1. So we'll take a look at that. Rook to c1. And so the threat now is that if the queen captures this knight, well, then you have the rook moving over to h1 and pinning. So if the queen captures the knight, the rook can move to h1 and pin that queen to the king. So, an interesting tactical possibility there that would steer the game into either a winning advantage or at least a slight advantage for white here. So now, let's see, rook to e4. Attacking the queen. Looks like e5 is possible. I thought maybe going over here and blocking, but then that's not as good. So rook to e4, attacking the queen here. And now we have the best move, and the only one that works for white is queen to g5, getting out of that attack. And now rook to e5, attacking. Queen, let's see, to f4. Yeah, this would have been difficult. I mean, I'm sure Capablanca could figure it out, but some of these positions, now he has options, but some of those other moves, he had one move that worked. Now we have queen captures. Oh, okay, and you're attacking the queen here. But, what about the pin? If we go here, still have that pin available. The computer now is saying rook takes on c6 is the best here. All right, so I don't know. I'm going to take a look at this. If we had that, well, then it looks like queen. Oh, I forgot. Then you have that block again. the block would still work with the rook moving here. So if we go back one, looks like rook capturing here. Now this rook is under attack, but you would have queen takes f4, g takes f4, rook takes e2, and check here. Anyway, you get the picture before I veer off too crazy here. So even though this was a strategical game, a lot of tactics. So because of this tactical move, now after exchanges here, if we look at the position, we have 5 pawns to 4. So those tactics led to, well, we better play on further here. Now the game is evened up again. So, further moves here. Knight checks. So, a tactic here, forking the king and the pawn. The king moves, we pick off this pawn. So, another tactic led to Capablanca being up a pawn here. Now, this move is an inaccuracy. It looks like g5 would have been better. The knight retreats here. And now we have black trying to trade off a pawn, which Capablanca captures. And check here. So the king moves. And this is an interesting move. And if we go back one, also here we have a possibility of a fork, but the king would be able to pick off this knight. So white moves up here to protect, and then the pawn protects the knight here. Now we have rook to f3. Trying to cut off the king and protect this pawn. All right. So the rook maneuvers up, and where are we at here? We have a few more moves until the game ends. So we'll take a look. Rook checks, king moves, attacks the rook retreats, and now the knight is jumping up here, attacking this pawn. And now black tries to trade off the knights. So after f4 check, king retreats. The knight trade is avoided. And now the reason the knights are here's another piece of strategy. The knights are, when you have the knights on the board, it's more likely that the game will be decisive. If we got rid of the knights, well, then you just have rooks on the board with pawns, and 3 pawns to 2. It's more likely that the game would be a draw. So you can be down 1 pawn and still have a draw possible, with rooks on the board. But when knights are in the mix, then things are a lot crazier, and there's more possibilities to win the game. More of a possibility for decisive games when the knights are on board with those rooks. All right, so we have the king attacking the knight. The knight moves up with check, and actually, the game ended after we had knight to g4 and king to h5. So why did the game end here? And I'll see what the computer says, how the game may have continued. But if we look at the tactics that happened in the game, that allowed white to get that extra pawn. But there was a lot of strategy involved. So, leave comments on what you think. If most games are really decided by tactics, or if you feel that strategy plays the biggest part, and end game knowledge, opening knowledge. What do you think decides most chess games? I just feel that tactics plays a huge part, and not outright tactics. Sometimes the tactical threats that the opponent may be able to stop, but those tactics kind of force them to make certain moves that could be to your advantage, even when the material's kind of even. All right, so let's see how the game may have continued. We have a check here. The king moves, and then this possibility right here with a mate. So that is why Capablanca's opponent, Vera Manchik, resigned there because of the tactical threat of a checkmate with the knight and rook. So if we go back after knight to g4, at this point it's a mate in 2, and there's no way to stop it, so that's why they resigned. If we go back, mate in 3, mate in 3. I'm trying to see how far back there was a mate in 4. All right, so at this point, white is ahead by +2, and it looks like king to h6 is best. So that was the mistake move that leads to a mate in 4 there. So if we look at an immediate king to h6 here, well then, now it recommends f4, just gaining space, pushing your unopposed pawn here, and then g5, giving the king a little bit of room, trying to trade off material. And now instead of trading, looks like f5 is best. Then g4, just giving up that pawn. And at this point, 2 pawns behind, it's looking worse for black. Anyway, that's some idea of how the game could have gone. Now, you might say, well, in this game, we have Capablanca, and what year was this again? Details, let me look. This was played in 1939, so towards the end of Capablanca's chess career, but still, he was one of the greatest players of all time, and he's playing against a lower-rated opponent, Vera Menchik. So the next game I'll show is 2 of the top players in the world, both former world chess champions. So we have, with white, Capablanca, and Emanuel Lasker with the black pieces. So this should be a more, well, the last game was interesting, but this one should be a really good one. 2 chess legends facing off here. And so we'll see how tactics and strategy play a part in this game. We'll do a quick game review. All right, so in this game, Capablanca had the white pieces, and he played at a 93.2% accuracy versus Emanuel Lasker playing at 88.6%. Now, this is interesting. Capablanca had 13 great moves in this game versus only 2, but, only 2. Great moves are still great. No brilliant moves. And then they each had 1 blunder and 1 miss. Now, Capablanca had 3 inaccuracies versus 2 by Lasker, and Lasker had 2 mistakes. So, this says white kept their eye out for endgame tactics and was rewarded with a victory. So, I had a viewer kind of, make a comment about the endgame maneuvering, and whether, how much is strategy and how much tactics are involved. And I have seen that a lot of times in the end game there are possible tactics that can be overlooked, and even at high level, there's some end game tactics that chess masters don't see and miss. So let's begin here and see what happens in this game. We have once again Capablanca playing more strategic with d4. His opponent responds with d5. And now knight to f3, kind of waiting to see how the opponent will respond. And so they're mirroring each other. But now c4, the queen's gambit here. Although this is the queen's pawn opening symmetrical variation according to the database here. But this pawn formation here is a queen's gambit formation. And then Queen's Gambit declined formation. So now it's transposed, I guess, into this Queen's Gambit declined because you're not capturing this pawn. So now we have a tactic, the pin on the knight against the queen here. And instead of breaking the pin, the other knight is played here to just back up this knight. So if we have a capture, we can have a recapture. And e3 to allow this bishop to develop and to back up this pawn in the center. And the pin is broken by developing the bishop here to e7, and black is ready to castle. So now we have knight to c3. So these are two of the greatest players in the world. And let me see what year this was played. 1921. So this is part of the 1921 World Championship match here between Lasker and Capablanca, where Capablanca ends up defeating Emanuel Lasker, who was world champion for a record 27 years. So pretty crazy to be world champion for that long. All right, so back to the analysis. We have castling, and then instead of developing the bishop and then castling, Capablanca takes time to move his rook here to the c file, because eventually, this pawn here will probably be captured or exchanged off, and the c file is a good location for this rook to target the queen side here. So continuing on, we have this move b6. So this is part of strategy, strategical thinking here. We have good bishops and bad bishops. Good bishops are bishops that the pawns in the center are on the opposite color as the good bishop. So the good bishop can maneuver between these pawns and is not restricted by the pawns. Whereas the bad bishop is restricted by these pawns that are on the light squares blocking that bishop in. So black has a situation here where he has to figure out what to do with this bishop. So he could put it here on b7, and sometimes even all the way here on a6 to help target this pawn. So finally, Capablanca captures, and then we have a recapture and queen to a4 here. So pretty interesting. White leaves his king in the center, maybe waiting to see what black is doing. And this also could prevent this bishop from moving here and trying to target and trade off this bad bishop for white's good bishop, which is another strategy. So we have c5 being played, attacking the center pawn here on d4, and now the queen making an interesting move here, jumping deep into black side of the board, attacking this unprotected rook here. So a bold move by Capablanca here. And continuing on, Lasker moves the rook, and then we have the knight moving here. So Capablanca is just on the attack, playing pretty fierce here. 2 pieces deep in enemy territory. This knight is threatening to capture with check or capture the bishop and get rid of the bishop pair. But there's the threat of the queen being attacked here with bishop to b7 attacking the queen. All right. Lasker attacks the queen, of course, but there are tactics here. So that attack on the queen can be ignored because of the tactical threat now of checking the king. So the king is being attacked, and you have to deal with that first, and then the queen can move. So capture, queen retreats, and now the rook trying to take control of the c file or fight for control of the c file, but it looks like the computer preferred an immediate capture here. Now, why would it want to trade? Well, the king is stuck in the center, so if you open up the center more, you could have tactical threats against the king here. All right, so now the queen moved here to a3 and was lining up on, if we go back and look at that. So the queen moves here and lines up on black's queen, which is unprotected. And that also prevents this pawn from capturing in the center now because of this attack on the queen. So that's another example of how you can dictate the strategy of the game by using tactics. So here's a pin on this pawn against the queen. And anytime you see any unprotected pieces, well, either on your side or your opponent's side, watch out. The flags, the red flags should go off, the warning bells, because when you have unprotected pieces, there could be tactical threats against them. So white has this unprotected rook here, which this rook is lining up on. The queen is unprotected. So now the queen moves to get off of that line, and it's protected by the f pawn now. Although it looks like better would have been to just go here, and then you have a battery lining up on the king side with the bishop and the queen. All right, so the Capablanca captures, giving up his bishop pair, but knocking out a defender of the king side. But the queen captures here, and it looks like better would have been to ignore that, just leave it under attack still, and capture this knight here. So, queen captured instead. Now we have this move, which is a great move by Capablanca. So, he basically pins this bishop to the rook. In response, Lasker just ignores that, attacks the knight. Capablanca takes the rook, but now we have the rook recapturing. And now, if we look at this, we have 2 unprotected pieces, a bishop under attack here. And now what should Capablanca do in this position? So does he want to capture this bishop that's unprotected? Well, that's what he does. So now the queen captures with the threat right here of just picking off this rook. So the king doesn't move up here, of course, which would allow a further attack by the queen. But instead, the rook just moves over. And it looks like the computer prefers rook to f1 to just protect this pawn. But by moving here, the rook is lined up on the king side. And So this could present some tactical opportunities, with a mating threat, especially if this queen can at some point get lined up over here, on this g7 pawn. So continuing on, we have the rook lining up here, pinning this pawn to the king, and the threat is to capture here, and then this pawn cannot recapture. So a lot of pressure. Emanuel Lasker is building up the pressure on white's king, which is stuck in the center here. So the queen jumps in here to help, and now we have this g6 move, which kind of blocks the bishop from any future threats on the g-pawn, and gives the king room to breathe if it needs to jump in here. So now the king moves to f1, and this is an inaccuracy by Capablanca. It looks like better would have been rook to g3 to just go ahead and attack the queen. All right, so the king moves. And the king probably wanted to get off of this line of the rook, and now it looks like Lasker makes the mistake here. Rook to e4, and better would have been, let's see, knight to f6 to try and activate this knight and get this knight into the game. So now we have a blunder by Capablanca. So if we go back, it looks like the best move would have been to capture this pawn here. But, we could add a knight recapture with an attack on the queen. So that may be why that didn't happen. But we can take a look at this. So capture. Then best would be the knight to recapture. Knight to e5 is not as good. So this is the best move here. And then queen to d1 to just retreat back and attack the opponent's queen. So here, trying to exchange off material. So once again, white is ahead in material here and wants to exchange off pieces. And looks like queen to h3, just avoiding the exchanges would be better. Okay, so back to this queen to d1 move. So a blunder. Now let's see why this is a blunder. Looks like the best move. The game is about even now. If we look at the material, we have 6 pawns versus 6, but we have knight versus rook. So Capablanca has the advantage so far here. All right. So queen to d1. The computer does not like that. And now we have queen to h3. A great move is played. And the best move in response, blocking with the rook. And now the knight jumps in here, but this is a miss. So better would be to just go ahead and capture here. And then either rook to c8 check, or just recapture with the pawn. So take your pick on those. Capturing with the pawn. We can take a look at that. Knight to f6. Now it doesn't like that. It actually likes the rook move better. So we could go back. Where were we here? All right. Anyway, queen to d1, queen to h3 check, block with the rook, knight to f6 here. So I'll try and move this along before this video gets too crazy long. So knight to f6 is a miss. Better would have been to open up the center here, try and trade off the pawns. Because if you're behind in material, you want to trade off as many pawns as you can. And why do you want to do that? Well, if you trade off all the pawns, And then, even with the advantage, let's say you trade a pair of rooks. Well, then you have a knight and a rook. A knight and king versus a rook and king. It's harder to get play out of that. It'll probably end up in a draw. Um, Especially if all the pawns are gone. But the more pawns that are still on the board, then whoever has that extra material can try and use that to push one of those pawns and promote it. And that's easier to do when you have more material, more pieces. All right, so the king moves over here, getting out of this pin on the rook by the queen and protecting this h pawn. All right, so capture. And now this move, a great move here. Instead of recapturing, we bring the rook up here and pin this pawn to the rook, although the knight is protected there. But white would want to trade off more material, trade off more pieces, I should say, since he's ahead in material. But now, after this exchange, let's see, capture, capture. So we're trading off. Knight captures, and then check. All right, so the king is forced to move. We have another check, and now this knight can be picked off here. But the knight blocks the check here. So interesting thing to look at. The queen moves here to try and pick off this knight, and we have a fork, but forks don't always work. If one of the pieces that's being attacked can retreat and block the attack on the king there. So capture. The queen moves up here to help try and protect everything, protect the knight, which is pinned. When a piece is pinned, with that tactic, you want to just add more pressure to the pinned piece. So this rook could try and move over here and add to the attack, which it does. Then we have g5 trying to gain more space, although the computer prefers this b pawn push. All right, so now this move, which is interesting, the h pawn, which is isolated, jumps up here to get rid of this weakness and tries to trade itself off. And also, if this pawn captures, well, now we've broken apart these pawns here, and there's less cover for the king. All right, so capture, queen captures, and now this interesting move here. The knight jumps up into the position, forking the rook and the pawn, and now we have a check. King retreats. The rook jumps forward, blocking the line, the protective line of the queen on this knight. So now we have the pawn here moving to protect that knight. Queen check. King moves. Queen checks again. And now Lasker's trying to probably offer a draw by repetition, just moving back and forth here. So Capablanca checks one more time, but now he moves this pawn instead of going for the draw, and it looks like he should have just captured this right here. So now we have the queen move, and we're getting down near the end here. We just have a few more moves. So the queen and rook form a battery here, and now check, block. Finally, that pawn is captured, but now the computer wasn't a fan of that, and so the knight attacks the queen. All right, so check. So, I don't know, if we take a quick look at this, where are we at? Now, Lasker has made a blunder here, which will decide the game. So, this was a blunder. Looks like the king should have jumped into the center of the board here. So I guess we can take a quick look at that. Queen to b7. We have, and then that was the mistake. So instead, to keep the game even, looks like the best is king to d6, but even moving forward to any of these three squares would keep the game about even. But this is the best move. And then queen to f3, knight to d5. But this is kind of difficult when the king is out in the open like this. So some tough maneuvering here. All right, so let's see why this move here was the blunder that ends the game. So now we have queen to b8, a great move, and Lasker resigns. So let's see what caused him to resign here. So the computer says the game may have gone, let's see, king to e7, the best move. Then this move here, queen to e5. Now the computer's saying rook to e5 would have been better. But this here forces an exchange. So capture, then a fork here. So now white is just winning. And it looks like tactics did decide the game here at the end. So if we go back and take a quick look at that, after this move here and the queen checking, the king moves out, and so that's best. But this allows the trade here. So it's forced, and then the fork at the end. All right, so that's why Lasker resigned. Okay, well, this video is going on quite a bit, so I don't know. What do you all think? Do tactics decide most chess games? How much does strategy and opening study and end games, how much does that all play a part? Or do tactics drive, is that the deciding factor of everything? In openings, end games, strategy, do the underlying tactics decide how the game goes overall? I don't know. That's kind of what I think, that tactics are always a part of every move. You have to look at every move before you make it to watch out that a tactic doesn't surprise you, especially one that could give up a piece, or lead to checkmate. All right, well, I better end the video here. It went on quite a while. I hope you enjoyed these two games. Please leave any comments or suggestions. Like and subscribe and support the channel if you haven't already. And thank you all for watching, and have a super chess day.